everyone, thanks so much for joining me for another episode of Once Upon a Murder. Today I want to talk about the murders. So, I guess they're not the ones that are being murdered. So, today I want to talk about the 12 young women that were murdered by Fred and Rosemary West. The murders took place between 1967 all the way to 1987 in Gloucestershire. Forgive me if I said that wrong. Gloucestershire. The murders all took place in the UK.
Gloucestershire.
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 Gloucestershire. There were at least 12 young women murdered from 1967 all the way to 1987 in what is now called the House of Horrors. For good reason. All the murders included rape, bondage, torture, and or mutilation. Okay, so this murder has a lot of names, so please bear with me. I'm going to try and make this as clear and concise as possible. But there's a lot going on here. So Fred West actually began these killings long before he had met Rosemary West, but she is now known to be an accomplice for many of his murders. However, we're going to start at a timeline before he had met Rosemary, and then we'll get there. In 1962 is kind of when everything really starts to snowball. In September 1962, Fred West started seeing Catherine Bernadette Costello. We'll refer to her as Rena from now on. And he was about 21 years old, though they had met 2 years prior to that. Rena had come back to England because she was pregnant from a Pakistani bus driver, and to avoid any sort of harassment about the mixed race of her child, she moved back to England. On November 17th, Fred West and Rena had gotten married, and they moved to Coat Ridge, where Fred worked as an ice cream van driver. In March of 1963, Rena gave birth to Charmaine West, and in order to avoid any questions about her mixed heritage, they told people that Rena had actually suffered a miscarriage, and Charmaine was their adopted daughter. After Charmaine's birth, they went and moved to the Bridgetown district of Glasgow. Rena again was pregnant, and not too short after Charmaine was born in July 1964, she gave birth to Anna Marie West. So basically from the beginning of their life, the girls were treated harshly by Fred West, and they were basically kept in cages. They were only allowed out when he was at work, and they had to be put back as soon as he got home. Short after Anna Marie was born, Issa McNeil came to be a live-in nanny for the family, and later on had introduced them to a friend of hers called Anne McFall, who eventually also moved in with the family. Fred had started having multiple affairs and actually got one of his mistresses pregnant. And when Rena heard about this, she decided, okay, screw it, I'm gonna have an affair as well. And so she started seeing this man named John McLaughlin. McLaughlin probably is a better pronunciation. John McLaughlin actually was very protective of Rena and her daughters, and whenever he would see Fred beating on them or calling them nasty names, he would come over and beat him up. In November of 1965, Fred actually hit and killed accidentally a 4-year-old boy with his ice cream van. He had left Glasgow and went to Gloucester. Pronunciation. Gloucester with his 2 young daughters, Charmaine and Anna Marie. So for about 3 months, it was just Fred and the 2 young girls. 3 months later, Rena, Issa, and Anne McFall had all moved over to Gloucester to join Fred and the girls. By 1967, Fred had total control over the 3 women, constantly abusing them and known to violent mood swings. He began sexually abusing his 3-year-old daughter, Charmaine, and started prostituting his wife, Rena, out for some extra cash. One night, Rena, her lover, John McLaughlin, Issa, and Issa's boyfriend had all made this plan to help the girls and the daughters escape from Fred's house. However, Anne McFall had fallen in love with Fred West, and when she heard of this plan, she told him what they were planning on doing. So when the night came, the gentleman had come over to take the girls, and Fred did not leave for work. Instead, he called the cops and told them that they were trying to kidnap the girls, and so the four were asked to leave. So it was again only Anne McFall, Fred West, and the two young girls. Anne McFall at this point had gotten the idea in her head that Fred was going to leave Rena and that they were going to get married and they were going to live happily ever after. From 1966 to 1967, Rena, Fred West, Anne McFall, and the two girls lived in the home. In July 1967, 18-year-old Anne McFall had gone missing. She was actually never reported, but later on her remains were found. She was 8 months pregnant with Fred West's child, and they found her remains outside of a cornfield. Her womb had been ripped out of her stomach, and some of her fingers and toes were missing. Her remains were actually not found until June 1994, so that's almost 30 years later. Her body was found with cord wrapped around her wrists and her ankles to suggest that she had been bound before she was killed. So in 1968, Rena left the girls in Fred's care, and not too short after that, in 1969, Fred had met Rosemary Letts shortly after her 15th birthday. Rosemary was about 15 and Fred was somewhere around 28 when they had met, and Fred had actually gained her sympathy by telling her that his wife had left him alone with his two daughters. Rosemary actually was a nanny for the girls for a short time and had showed them a lot of love and affection at first. Rosemary and Fred had started dating shortly after, and her parents, after a lot of fighting, they eventually kicked her out, and she was 16 years old, pregnant, and had moved in with Fred by 1970. In October 1970, Rosemary gave birth to Heather Ann, which was their first child together. 2 months after Heather Ann's birth, however, Fred was in prison for some petty theft. So for 5 months, Rosemary, who was barely 17 years old, was the only caretaker for these 3 little girls. There was constant verbal and physical abuse. A lot of it was directed at Charmaine. One of Charmaine's young friends one day had walked into the house, and Charmaine was standing naked on a chair. She was bound and gagged with her arms tied behind her back, and Rosemary was standing over her with a big wooden spoon. Charmaine was only 7 years old at the time, but her friend said that she stood there totally calm and unbothered, which is especially sad because I think that just shows how used to it that she was. Sometime before Fred was released, it's believed that Rosemary actually killed Charmaine, and she told everyone, including Charmaine's sisters, that she had actually been taken back by Rena, her mother. When Fred was released from prison in June of 1971, he actually buried her naked body out in the yard. Years later, when Charmaine's body was uncovered in the backyard, she had several toe, finger, ankle, and wrist bones missing. So Rena Costello was last seen on her way to Fred West to confront him about her daughters and what they believe was her asking for custody, actually. They believe that Rena was strangled in Fred's car, and later on when her remains were found, she had been sexually assaulted and dismembered. She was put in several plastic bags. She was murdered in 1971 at the age of 27 years old. On January 29, 1972, Fred West and Rosemary Letts had gotten married. Rose was pregnant again, and soon enough they moved into 25 Cromwell Street, which is what now is considered to be the House of Horrors. The house was fairly large, and they often rented up the upstairs rooms to different lodgers. So people often rented out different rooms in the house, and on June 1st, May June was born. Shortly after the birth of May June, Rose actually began prostituting in the upstairs bedrooms. She would have sex with many of the lodgers that stayed there, as well as different clients that came just to see her. Sometime around 1977, Rose's father even became one of her clients. By 1983, Rose had 8 children, 3 of which belonged to clients of hers, though Fred West had taken them in and raised them as his own. The children were constantly, severely physically abused by Rose. She would often just whatever she had close by, she would hit them with it. She had slash marks on several of her children. They were constantly covered in bruises, welts, different cuts. From 1972 to 1992, Rose's children had 31 hospital visits to the ER alone. House of Horrors is a really good name. Soon enough, Fred West had, once some of his daughters had hit puberty, had begun to sexually assault many of them. At 13 years of age, they began to prostitute Anna Marie, and they told all of her clients that she was 16. In October of 1972, Caroline Owens was hired to be their live-in nanny. She was 17 years old at the time and shared a room with Anna Marie, who she described as very quiet. When Caroline Owens felt that Rose and Fred had been trying to make a move on her, she made an announcement that she wanted to leave the Cromwell house. So that night she had left, and Rose and Fred had known that she had an area where she had hitchhiked, because that's actually where they picked her up, and they went to that area. They told her that they were sorry. They convinced her to get back in the car, and they basically abducted her. They made advances on her in the back of the car, and when she tried to refuse them, Fred actually hit her until she was unconscious. They beat her, they gagged her, and they bound her. They kept her in one of the rooms in the house for several days until she eventually told them that she would agree to whatever it is that they wanted, and that she would stay as their live-in nanny, and as well as whatever else they needed her for. One day when Rose and Caroline had gone to the laundromat, Caroline had actually escaped and made it home, and when her mother had seen her bruises and her welts, immediately Caroline kind of fessed up to everything that had happened, and they were ultimately arrested and brought to court. Caroline Owens, however, decided that she was not able to face them again, and so the case was dropped, and ultimately they just had to pay a small fine, and they were able to walk free. One of their first murders together was Linda Gauff. Linda Gauff regularly came to the home to visit two different lodgers, and on April 19th, 1973, she had moved in. On April 20th, the very next day, when she wasn't around and nobody knew where she was, Rose and Fred said that they had kicked her out for trying to make advances on her children. When Linda Gauff's body was found, she had adhesive tape, and her jaw was all covered up to muffle any screams. She had two small tubes shoved up her nasal cavities for breathing, and she was bound and tied and had died of strangulation. She was also missing several toe and finger bones, and 5 of her neck vertebrae were missing as well, so she was decapitated. Carol Ann Cooper was a 15-year-old abducted November 10th, 1973, waiting for the bus. This is actually how they abducted many of their victims, all ranging between the age of 15 to 21. They either abducted them from a bus stop or found them hitchhiking. So this was their way of picking up and abducting women. They did this for about 17 months, and from the bodies that were found, investigators say that the torture got a little worse and worse each time. They believe that all the girls were bound up and hung from holes that were carved into the different wooden beams that were supporting the ceiling in the cellar. 18-year-old Juanita Mott was abducted and killed April 1975, and after her death, Fred West had concreted the cellar floor to cover any of the bodies that were under there, and had turned it into a bedroom for his children after that, which is gross. I mean, all of it's gross anyway. So the murders had come to somewhat of a stop for about a year after Juanita Mott, until May of 1978, when 18-year-old Shirley Robinson was murdered. Shirley had moved in as a lodger and was heavily pregnant with a son. Rose was also pregnant at the time, and it's believed that she got pretty jealous. She had also gone around and said that Shirley's baby was Fred's. The body had also been extensively dismembered. However, this was the only one that they did not find any restraints on. Anna Marie West ran away from home in 1979 after she had come back from a ectopic pregnancy surgery, and Rose had repeatedly punched her in the stomach. After this, Heather and Mae West both became the main targets for Fred and Rose. Fred West is often quoted by his children as saying, "I made you, I can do what I like to you." To be honest, I don't know how many children they had at this point, but there were a lot. Heather West was often very quiet in school, and she refused to shower after any sort of gym or activities that they had at the school. But one day she had been forced to take a shower, and her peers and teachers saw that she was covered with bruises and welts that were in different stages of healing. From this point forward, Fred was constantly escorting Heather and the other girls and boys to and from school. After she left school in 1987, Heather was constantly looking for jobs and different ways to escape the house. One day when her siblings had come home from school, Fred and Rose told them that Heather got a job far away and was no longer living at the house. As time went on, the siblings asked why Heather never reached out, never made contact with them, and they changed their story and said that she had eloped with her lesbian lover. Soon enough, they had this joke where Fred would say that Heather was under the patio. This became a joke that was used by the family, that Heather was under the patio. On August 6, 1992, one of Fred's 13-year-old daughters had accused him of trying to rape her and sodomizing her. When the authorities were contacted, a small but quick investigation was done on all the children. There were consistencies of physical and sexual abuse, and the very next day, August 7th, 1992, the children were sent to foster care. It wasn't long after that the children had mentioned the under the patio joke when discussing Heather West. Fred and Rose West had changed their stories again, said that it was no use looking for her because she was involved in credit card fraud. Another time they said that she had some serious drug problems. When the authorities couldn't find Heather West, this actually ended up in a search warrant that was used to excavate the garden in February 1994. So after a long process of Fred confessing to where all the bodies were, Fred boasted about having more than 20 plus victims. They found Heather West's body. She had been dismembered with a knife, sexually assaulted, and restrained just like the other victims. One of Fred West's sons actually said that they had dug a hole where Heather's body was found, but that his father told him it was for a fish pond. Years later, one of the West boys, one of the youngest ones, who was 7 years old at the time, claims that he saw his parents murder Heather and that Rose had stomped on Heather's head until she wasn't moving anymore. Rose maintains her innocence to this day, says that she had nothing to do with the murders, but she still got life in prison. Praise Jesus. Fred West, however, committed suicide by hanging January 1st, 1995. In October 1996, the house was completely demolished, everything completely from the ground to the top. They didn't want anybody to find any souvenirs or remember this place as anything other than what it was, which was a house of horrors. I'm going to go ahead and read a list of all the victims from Fred and or Rose West. Anne McFall was 18 years old and died in 1967. Mary Basthom was 15 years old and went missing in 1968. Fred West confirmed that he was the one who killed her, but her body was never found. Charmaine West was 8 years old. Rena Costello was 27 years old, and both of them were murdered in 1971. In 1973, Linda Gauff, who was 19, Carol Ann Cooper, who was 15, and Lucy Partington, who was 21, were all murdered. In 1974, Therese Siegenthaler was 21 years old. Shirley Hubbard was 15 years old. They were both murdered. In 1975, 18-year-old Juanita Mott was murdered. In 1978, 18-year-old Shirley Robinson was murdered. Allison Chambers was 16 years old in 1979 when she was murdered. In 1987, 16-year-old Heather West was murdered by her parents. Thanks so much for watching another excruciating video with me. Sometimes these are hard to get through, but I really like doing the research. I like learning about this stuff. Feel free to send me any suggestions that you have, anything that you want to see. Murders, unsolved and solved, disappearances. I really like looking into this stuff. Please feel free to like, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you like with these videos, what you don't like. Yeah.